Welcome back to the channel. We're super excited to dive into today's topic. Today, we're diving deep into one of the most turbulent periods in American history, the 2 decades leading up to the Civil War, from 1840 to 1860. This wasn't just a time of disagreement. It was an era of explosive growth, profound change, and deepening fractures that would ultimately tear the nation apart. So, how did America go from a hopeful republic to a nation on the brink of self-destruction? Let's find out. Our story begins in 1840. The United States was a nation brimming with energy and ambition. A powerful idea known as manifest destiny had taken hold of the American imagination. This was the belief that the nation was divinely ordained to expand its borders from the Atlantic to the Pacific. It was a romantic and powerful notion, driving pioneers, politicians, and settlers westward into vast, untamed territories. This wasn't just about land, it was about spreading American ideals of liberty and democracy. However, this noble vision had a dark side, as it often meant the displacement and subjugation of Native American populations and set the stage for conflict with neighboring countries, particularly Mexico. This push for growth really spiraled into conflict and chaos. Right, it's wild. The Mexican-American War, which raged from 1846 to 1848, was a direct result of America's expansionist hunger, particularly its annexation of Texas. The United States emerged victorious, and the prize was enormous. Through the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, Mexico ceded a massive swath of territory that includes present-day California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, and parts of New Mexico, Colorado, and Wyoming. On the surface, this was a monumental triumph. The dream of manifest destiny was largely realized. But this victory came with a poisonous pill. The critical question that no one could agree on was, would these new territories be free, or would they allow slavery? Every square mile of new land became a battleground for political power between the industrializing North and the agrarian, slave-holding South. The war didn't solve America's problems, it just gave them a much larger map. While the nation was expanding geographically, it was also transforming internally. The North was buzzing with excitement during its big industrial revolution. Factories sprouted up, and cities like New York, Boston, and Philadelphia swelled with new populations. This growth was fueled by waves of immigrants, primarily from Ireland and Germany, who were fleeing famine and political unrest in Europe. They provided the labor that powered the new industries, but their arrival also created new social tensions. The North was becoming a diverse, urban, and industrial society, while the South remained largely rural, agricultural, and economically dependent on the institution of slavery. This growing economic and cultural divergence created two very different Americas, each viewing the other with increasing suspicion and misunderstanding. In an attempt to hold this fracturing nation together, politicians crafted a series of fragile compromises. The Compromise of 1850 was a complex package of laws designed to appease both North and South. For the North, California was admitted as a free state. For the South, a much stricter Fugitive Slave Act was passed. This law was a flashpoint of outrage. It required all citizens, even those in free states, to assist in the capture and return of escaped slaves. Federal marshals could deputize ordinary citizens and force them to join slave-catching posses. This brought the brutal reality of slavery to the doorsteps of Northerners who had previously been able to ignore it. Instead of calming tensions, the Fugitive Slave Act galvanized the abolitionist movement and turned many neutral Northerners firmly against the South's peculiar institution. The law was meant to be a bridge, but it ended up being a wall of fire. The illusion of compromise was shattered completely thus a few years later with the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. This controversial law, championed by Senator Stephen Douglas, introduced the idea of popular sovereignty. It proposed that the settlers in the new territories of Kansas and Nebraska should decide for themselves whether to allow slavery. This effectively repealed the Missouri Compromise of 1820, which had banned slavery in this part of the country for over 3 decades. The result was chaos. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers flooded into Kansas, each side determined to win the territory for their cause. The political contest quickly descended into violence. Abolitionists and border ruffians from neighboring Missouri engaged in raids, arson, and murder. The territory became known as Bleeding Kansas, a horrifying miniature civil war that foreshadowed the national conflict to come. It proved that the issue of slavery was too volatile to be settled with ballots. It was now being settled with bullets. The political landscape was also fracturing and reforming in response to these crises. The old Whig Party, unable to take a clear stance on slavery, disintegrated. In its place, a new political force emerged in 1854, the Republican Party. It was a coalition of anti-slavery Whigs, Northern Democrats, and members of the Free Soil Party. Their unifying principle was clear and powerful. They were unequivocally opposed to the expansion of slavery into the Western territories. They weren't necessarily calling for the immediate abolition of slavery where it already existed, but their free soil, free labor, free men platform was a direct challenge to the South's political and economic power. And in 1858, a lanky lawyer from Illinois named Abraham Lincoln rose to national prominence during a series of debates for a Senate seat. Though he lost that election, his eloquent arguments against the spread of slavery positioned him as a leading voice of the new Republican Party. By 1860, the United States was a nation in name only. The bonds of union had been stretched to their breaking point. The economic gap between the industrial North and the agrarian South was wider than ever. The cultural divide, fueled by decades of mutual distrust, had become a chasm. The political system, once a forum for compromise, was now a stage for non-negotiable demands. Landmark Supreme Court decisions like the Dred Scott case of 1857, which declared that African Americans were not citizens and had no rights, further convinced the North that the federal government was controlled by a pro-slavery conspiracy. The election of Abraham Lincoln as president in 1860, without a single Southern electoral vote, was the final straw for the South. They saw his victory as a direct threat to their way of life, their economy, and their very identity. The time for talking was over. The storms of change that had been gathering for 2 decades finally broke, and the nation plunged into the dark and bloody abyss of the Civil War. The years from 1840 to 1860 show us how a nation's greatest ambitions can contain the seeds of its own destruction. The drive for expansion, the clash of economies, and the moral crisis of slavery created a perfect storm that made division seem not just possible, but inevitable. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey through a pivotal era of American history. If you found this video informative, please hit the like button, subscribe to our channel, and ring that notification bell so you don't miss our next episode. Let us know in the comments what you think was the single biggest turning point on the road to the Civil War. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.